Hello, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with Your Kids, Sexual Violence and Consent, hosted by the Durham Rape Crisis Center. My name is Isabella Juga. I am a counselor and the public education coordinator at the DRCC, and I'm just here to introduce our lovely ladies today and help out with any moderation, questions and answers, things like that. So you won't be hearing too much from me today, but just wanted to introduce two of our lovely DRCC staff members. We have Michaela Barsana. She is our intake counselor, and Karina
Benning.
Thank you. I always struggle with that. She is our counselor and volunteer community development coordinator. So we want to thank them for hosting our webinar today. This is a really interesting topic. I don't believe DRCC has done something like this in quite some time, so we're very excited about it. And so before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping memos. So we ask that everyone remains on mute just to avoid any crossover talk, background noises, things like that. However, we will be having a Q&A section at the end of our webinar today. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to put that in the chat at any time, and Diana and I will make sure that your questions or comments are addressed at the end. But if you wanted to verbally share a comment or have a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself at that time. And just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. Oh, and as you heard, this is a recorded webinar. So for those of you who have joined us today, feel free to keep your cameras off if that is what makes you more comfortable. There's no pressure at all to turn those on. Okay, so I'm gonna pass the mic over to Karina.
Yeah, so we just wanted to start with a brief land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the DRCC sits on the lands of the people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations within the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and in the territory covered by the Williams Treaty. So we're very grateful to be here and to be able to use this land, and very humble in that we are here as settlers. So I'm going to pass it over to Michaela and we'll get started into our presentation.
Okay, so just to start off with a few quick statistics. In 2016, 53% of police reported sexual assaults were for children and youth under the age of 18. 19% of all reports were for children under the age of 12. That's from Statistics Canada in 2016. Since 2019, the following offense increases have occurred. 29% increase in the creation and distribution of child pornography, 19% increase in the possession or accessing of child pornography, and 15% increase in incidents of luring children online. That's from the Canadian Centre of Child Protection 2021. Obviously, these statistics are disturbingly high, which is why it's so important for us to be having these conversations with our kids. On to you, Karina.
Yeah, so just kind of more on that research. I'm just gonna remove this. Okay. 1 in 10 Canadians report being sexually victimized before they turned 18. And in most of those cases, the offender is known to the child. It's not as much sort of strangers, which we'll talk about in a minute. And most of these incidents weren't disclosed when adults now were children, and 93% of child abuse cases are never brought forward to police or child welfare. And there's a lot of reasons for that we'll kind of go into and kind of how to promote that disclosure in children. But it's really disturbing to know that cases aren't brought forward. And there's a lot of child sexual abuse cases that no one really even knows about. So a lot of these statistics may not be accurate because there is a lot of underreporting as well in terms of how many cases of child abuse there are.
Okay, so I think most of us, probably all of us, were raised with the idea of stranger danger. The concept of not talking with someone you don't know because they could abduct you was very much so drilled into us at a young age. And while it's important to talk to kids about the risks of talking to strangers, it's more likely for them to experience sexual abuse by someone that they know. So creating or promoting situational awareness for kids is really just as important as teaching them about stranger danger. I'm a mom of 2 young girls, and I will share that my youngest has the worst situational awareness ever. She has literally walked into a tree because she's too busy looking at her feet. So this is definitely something that can be taught to children, and they really do pick up on it. So some examples of situational awareness might be picking up on cues around them. So emotions in the room, strange behaviors from others, paying attention to surroundings. Teaching situational awareness will increase confidence and safety. So some examples for safety, it can help to avoid human and environmental dangers. So for example, a hanging street light, seeing an animal that might pose a risk. For memory, where is a car parked? What's a password? Something I struggle with quite a bit. So situational awareness improves safety, memory, and general awareness. And there's quite a few things that we can do with kids to try and improve that. Lots of fun games. Think of doing an observation scavenger hunt with kids. Some great places for that would be out on a nature walk, if you're on a car drive, or even at the mall, and having a list of things that you want them to observe while they're out. And afterwards, a really fun idea is just testing memory. Do you remember what color the car was that was parked next to us? These things are all really important, and we can make learning fun for kids. On to you, Karina.
Okay, so part of this conversation, we wanted to just touch on grooming and human trafficking, which could be and definitely is a whole webinar in itself. And I would definitely like to direct you to Victim Services, who does a lot of great work on this. But just to kind of touch on it, because it is important in terms of the conversation of sexual violence and consent. Human trafficking is quite prevalent in Canada, and particularly in the Durham region. Most human trafficking cases in Canada are in Ontario. And it's very different than what we've been kind of taught to know human trafficking to be. It's very different than what we see in movies and on TV. A lot of it is domestic, whereas what we usually see in movies on TV is very international. Someone gets kidnapped. I think a common example is the movie Taken with Liam Neeson. And that's really not the case for human trafficking in Canada. Facilitators of human trafficking often build relationships with victims. And it doesn't usually involve like kidnapping or anything. They kind of look for people who are vulnerable and make them feel loved, make them feel needed and special. And it often builds that interpersonal relationship that then leads to exploitation, manipulation, and human trafficking. So most victims refer to their trafficker as their boyfriend or girlfriend. So again, building those really intimate relationships first. And according to Victim Services of Durham Region, 83% of traffickers identify as male, and 89% of them are under the age of 35. So I think a lot of times we have this idea that traffickers are kind of older men, like preying on younger girls, but really they're going to be around the same age as a young girl. And 95% of victims are women and girls, with the average age of luring being 12 to 15. So the luring stage is that initial stage where those relationships are being built. So it really is important to kind of look out for some of those red flags and just kind of make sure you have that open communication with your child. So some of those red flags would be any abnormal changes in mood or behavior, maybe having a new boyfriend or girlfriend who maybe is a little bit older than them, maybe around the same age, but kind of any weird things in those relationships. So maybe they're getting expensive gifts, maybe they're getting their nails done all the time, paid for by the new significant other, any new substance dependencies, distancing from friends and family, things like that. And it's not to say that if there are these things present that human trafficking is present, but it's just something to be aware of. and just to have open communication with your child, because it is quite prevalent, particularly in the Durham region. We are going to be sending out a resource guide at the end of this presentation that has tons of resources, videos, links, things like that, and it will include a TED Talk from Carly Church, who works at Victim Services of Durham Region and is a survivor herself, and kind of talks about the stages of trafficking and grooming, and how kind of it happens, because it's not something that someone just approaches you and then starts trafficking you. It's a really slow process that kind of gets the victim emotionally attached to the trafficker. So that's really important to be aware of.
Okay, so the online landscape has certainly changed a lot since I was a child, because it didn't exist until I was a teenager. But as a parent or as a caregiver, it's really important for us to be aware of what's going on right now. Children are increasingly playing more and more online and having more of an online presence. So just being aware of the communication-based apps that children are using. So a quick Google search can usually help us know if there's any risks associated with that app. Talking with fellow parents about any concerns that you have or specific questions on how to navigate that. Setting parental controls where possible and reasonable based on the child's age. So privacy settings are also very important to prevent strangers from accessing your child's personal information. Also, I would say making sure the computer and tablet use are happening around you, particularly for younger children. When they are creating usernames, being sure to have them not include any identifying or personal information in there. As well as just having a conversation about what's appropriate to share and not share with people that they don't know online. Talking about healthy social media habits with your teenagers. Teenage girls in particular are shown to have an increased risk of suicide when exposed to increasing amounts of social media. This is according to a 10-year study. Limited social media use accompanied media literacy protects teenage girls from this risk. Jonathan Haidt is a psychiatrist in the States. He's a professor at one of the main universities. And he's done a few really interesting talks on this. He talks about how social media exacerbates normal anxieties that teenage girls experience, and how dangerous this can be. So particularly if you have teenage girls, I would encourage you to maybe read up on that a little bit more. Also important is to have healthy boundaries with your teenagers that respect their privacy and promotes trust. So banning social media or internet use is not the answer. And also monitoring all of their online activity, that's also not very helpful.
Yeah, so kind of one of the reasons that we wanted to have this webinar is because I think parents can be really concerned about when they should start having these conversations with their children, particularly around consent. And it's not that you have to start telling your 2-year-old about sexual violence or anything like that, but consent can really start at any age in terms of setting those examples and teaching them what it means to have autonomy over their body and their feelings and things like that. So basically, consent can be taught at any age that a child can communicate, and even before they can really communicate, just explaining things that you're doing or helping them with, and just building those strategies and setting those examples early on is really important. So with younger kids, where you might not be having conversations about, say, sexual violence, but you can still teach them to express their boundaries. So if they don't want a hug from grandma, for example, saying, I don't want a hug, I don't want to sit next to you right now, please leave me alone. And respecting those boundaries is really important. So particularly when it comes to, say, family members or friends of family, oftentimes parents will say, like, why don't you give them a hug, or you have to give them a hug. But respecting when the child says no is super important. Even though we know, say, grandma, for example, isn't going to harm them, letting your children know that they have the right to say no is very important, because when it comes to future interactions, you want them to already have those skills of knowing that they have control over their body and what they do with it. Because if they're taught that it doesn't matter what I want, I have to have this physical contact or I have to have this interaction with someone, then that kind of sticks with them when they get older and are maybe in more dangerous situations. So the earlier that children can learn that they can set and maintain boundaries, and that those boundaries will be respected, the better they'll be able to understand when their boundaries have been violated later. And parents play such an important role in this, and caregivers in general. And they can also set an example. So sometimes mom, dad, or caregiver, like you just need a minute to yourself. So setting a boundary with your child, saying, can you please sit over there right now? I need some of my personal space. And saying it in a way that shows them that you can be respectful is really important. And it's not just your child that can have boundaries, you can have boundaries as well. Just because you're their parent, it doesn't mean that you have to always have that contact. And it's also really important to know that when your child sets a boundary, it's not a personal rejection against you or against the family member. So it's not that they don't love grandma or they don't love their aunt or uncle. It's that right now they don't want to be touched, and they're expressing that. And that's important to remember, that it's really great that they are expressing that. It's not anything against you. Sometimes they just don't want to have that contact. And rather than sort of getting upset or making them feel guilty, it's really important that that is respected.
I totally agree, Karina. It definitely can feel like a sting when a child exercises that boundary, but I think as parents and caregivers, taking a step back and celebrating the fact that they felt safe enough to have that voice. That's so important.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm a big believer in promoting open and honest communication with children. I think it's one of the biggest ways that parents can support and protect their children from sexual abuse. Children should know that they can tell their parents or caregivers about anything that makes them feel uncomfortable, scared, or icky. Be patient is one thing that I would really encourage everyone to do. If a child is having strong emotions, don't rush them. Let them know that they can come back to the conversation if and when they're ready, or take a break as needed. Parents and caregivers should avoid any form of blaming or shaming if a child comes to them to share something, even if the parent feels that the incident was minor. An example, argument between siblings happens all the time in my house. If your child asks a question that makes you feel uncomfortable, it's really so much better to just take a moment and collect your thoughts rather than just brush them off. So one phrase that I use quite often, because my children are great at catching me off guard with awkward conversations, I would often just say to them, that's a really great or a really important question. Let me think about the best answer. Then I would also recommend writing it down or setting a reminder, because that shows your child that it is important and you're taking it seriously. Also encourage your child or teenager to call you if they ever need to be picked up from a party or event outside your home. If your teenager calls you when they're drunk or high, or having an outburst of anger or disappointment as a parent, may prevent them from contacting you when they're in danger in future, or if they're ever in that situation. And I would say the same is true for younger kids. We all make mistakes and not great choices, and just being aware of our reaction when they're reaching out to tell us. Parents and caregivers should also avoid encouraging children to keep secrets, even if it seems harmless. Sexual abusers often tell children that they should keep their interactions secret. So that's not something we really want to encourage.
Sorry, I'm just trying to change the slide here. So, there we go. So kind of on that line of communication, really, if a child is old enough to ask the question, they're old enough to hear the answer. And obviously we can tailor our answers based on their age and what kind of words they would understand or concepts they would understand. But if they're asking the questions, it means they're hearing about it somewhere. So it's better that we as parents or caregivers or professionals, give them the answer that is the most accurate and is going to be most helpful for them, rather than letting them hear it at school, on TV, on the internet, so many places where they might get the wrong information, which could put them in danger, or at the very least, just kind of give them the wrong idea of different things, whether that's body related, sex, sexuality, gender, anything like that. So if they ask you, again, if you want to take some time to think about it, like Michaela said, saying, I don't really know the answer right now, or let me think about the best answer, and getting back to them, or just giving them an answer that is kind of simplified for their age, or if they're older, having that conversation with them is really important. So in terms of kind of when this kind of curiosity in terms of our bodies and sexuality might start, it's really common for children from the ages of 2 to 5 to start touching their genitals. And that's according to a 2009 study that we found. So it's really early on that children kind of get curious about their bodies, right? It makes sense. It's right there, and they kind of want to know what it feels like to touch them and things like that. And this is such a great opportunity to promote boundaries and promote positive messages about their bodies. So really being body positive and not shaming them for their bodies or touching their bodies. But again, putting in boundaries about kind of when it's appropriate to do that touching. So saying something like, it's okay to touch those parts of our bodies in public, or some parts of our bodies in public, but other parts we only touch in private at home. And it's the same thing for non-sort of general related things. Like you might tell your child like they shouldn't scratch their bum when they're out in public, things like that. And so it's really a great opportunity to set those boundaries with them and kind of let them know what is kind of okay for in public and what's better for in private. But just to know that this is such a normal form of body exploration for children. It's not necessarily associated with sexual feelings or desires. And it's a great opportunity to teach them about their body and teach them kind of what is an appropriate touch for them. We will talk about that in a couple of minutes about kind of what's good touch and what's bad touch, so that they're aware of when something isn't right. And again, just normalizing this, their bodies, their thoughts, their feelings. So as children get older, they might come to you with thoughts of kind of desires for other people. So seeing people kiss on TV, having a crush, things like that, and not kind of shaming them or shutting it down, saying like, you shouldn't be having those feelings. Acknowledging it and having those conversations is so important. Just in terms of body positivity, not sort of talking down about your own body, and really promoting like positive relationships with our bodies is really important for kids to know, so that they don't feel shamed if they need to talk about it at some point.
Okay, so in terms of language, super important to use clear and anatomically correct language. Teach them the proper words for their body parts, and use this language naturally and regularly whenever appropriate. So there's a short little story I'm just going to read off. It's called The Cookie Story. So one day, a little girl told her teacher, "My uncle licked my cookie." The teacher thought nothing of it and said, "Next time, ask for another cookie." Months go by and the mother of the child is talking to the teacher about a rash on the child's cookie. And that's when the teacher realized what the child was trying to say. So this is just a really good example of why it's so important for us to use proper terminology with kids. Some parents can feel that a child is too young, and that naming these body parts will somehow not keep them innocent. But I think there's a big difference between knowing and not knowing is dangerous.
I also just wanted to add, when we were kind of looking for graphics for this presentation, that there aren't really any diagrams of children's bodies that include genital parts. So for example, the one here is kind of the most comprehensive, but there's nothing to do with sort of any private parts or anything like that. And if a child can say forehead or elbow or eyebrow, they can say vagina or penis or any of those parts. So it's kind of sad that we don't kind of teach kids that, to kind of know what the proper terminology is for their body, but we do it with everywhere else. And that really just contributes to the shame that they might feel about those parts of their body.
Absolutely. And adding on to that, I think also when they're at an appropriate age, naming the word sex for what it is, instead of not feeling uncomfortable and not saying it, because that in and of itself can also be another cookie situation, right?
Yeah. And even just for their own healthcare and things like that, like knowing proper terms for their body and knowing kind of how things work. If you look online, you can probably see 100 different articles of stories of people going to the doctor and having just absurd understandings of what sex and bodies and periods and all of those things, how those things work, basically. And on the one hand, it's funny. On the other hand, it's really sad that some people really just don't have an understanding of how those things happen, or what sort of the implications are of having sex and things like that. So kind of just going back to what we touched on earlier, pun not intended, about what good touch versus bad touch is, and just teaching your children that touch can impact us in different ways. So there's good touch where it feels good to be hugged or kissed by the people you love. So getting a hug in the morning or getting a kiss as you go to school, those things might make you feel good. And then there's bad touch, which makes you feel bad or uncomfortable. So this graphic says something like kicking, hitting, pinching, or slapping. But that could be being touched when you don't want to be touched. That would be bad touch. It could be being touched in a private area when it's something that's not for healthcare or for keeping you clean. So really having those conversations with your kids. So say if you're helping them to clean their genital areas, like having those conversations about, okay, this is to clean, but if someone ever touches you here and it, please let me know, or if it makes you uncomfortable, please talk to me if anyone touches you like that. So having the conversation about what feels good and what doesn't feel good, and what they should be maybe mentioning and what they're okay with, basically. And then just having a conversation again about kind of private parts, and yes, they're totally normal to want to explore and touch and things like that. But just to have that conversation about what's appropriate in public and things like that. So private parts are the ones that we cover with our swimsuits or our underwear. And that's somewhere that no one should touch other than your doctor or a parent if they're helping you clean. But even then, if you're not comfortable, that you should say something, because we do know that there is sexual abuse that happens on behalf of parents and medical professionals as well. So just being able to communicate when that touch becomes bad touch.
Right. So in terms of message delivery, parents and caregivers should always remember these few steps. Remain calm, keep a steady tone of voice, keep pace that's appropriate for the age of the child, avoid talking too fast or too slow. Very easy when we're feeling nervous to talk quickly, but that's really not helpful for them to absorb what you're trying to say. Also, avoid sharing too many statistics or providing information that will scare them. The goal is to keep them safe, not promote fear. And it doesn't have to be a long, drawn out conversation. Smaller amounts of information are usually more impactful. Also, I would definitely say this shouldn't be thought of as a one-time conversation, but as ongoing dialogue that matures as your child matures. An example, a really good example, like you wouldn't be able to sit down and have someone tell you everything about driving a car when you're first learning, and then you never hear it again and you're just expected to be a great driver. These are skills that you sort of build upon over time and build up. These conversations are exactly the same. It's definitely not a one and done.
Yeah, and just kind of building off of that sort of car metaphor, like maybe even before a child is able to drive a car, you're still teaching them things about car safety. So having a seatbelt on, things like that. So it's not kind of only when they're at the age where they could be thinking about or having sex that are you talking about things like consent. It's way before then, so that they don't become in danger of a car crash, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and we acknowledge that this is a really difficult conversation sometimes to have with your kids. Some people are very comfortable with it and open, and some people really struggle with it, especially if you're a survivor yourself. It can kind of go either way, where you're even more comfortable with it because you really want to make sure that your children don't experience the same thing, but also can be really difficult and triggering for yourself as well. The important thing to know is just how the benefits outweigh the discomfort of talking to your children about consent and about sexual violence. So think about what those benefits are. So keeping them safe, keeping them aware of their bodies, maybe promoting healthier habits in terms of just taking care of themselves. These benefits are so much more important than maybe some temporary discomfort we have when talking to our children. And like I said, like if you are a survivor yourself talking to a child about this, it can really cause some emotional dysregulation and maybe bring up some past trauma, which is really important to be aware of. So having those self-care strategies, those coping mechanisms is really important. Taking it one step at a time, like we said, you don't have to have the whole conversation at once, but just building little pieces of information for them and habits is really important. And just to know that there is support available to you. So we can provide support to a person who is supporting someone who has been a victim of sexual violence for up to 3 sessions of counseling. And if you are a survivor, we can provide up to 16 sessions. But even if you aren't a survivor or you're not supporting someone who's disclosed surviving sexual violence, we can provide support on our crisis line if you need any advice or debriefing or emotional support if you want to have this conversation with your kids. It's common that people will call us wondering how to have this conversation or wondering what to do if their child talks about something like this. So definitely you can always call our crisis line. The number will be on the resource sheet that we provide. It's on our website, and it'll also be at the end of this presentation. So it's definitely there if you need it. And then just kind of touching on what we should do if our child doesn't want to have this conversation either, because if it's uncomfortable for us, chances are it's going to be uncomfortable for them too, especially as they get a little bit older and are kind of taught that they shouldn't be having these conversations, or there's shame to be had around these conversations. So a couple of important things to remember would be to respect kind of the boundaries of your child, but also make sure the information is available to them if they would like it. So maybe it's putting a box somewhere with some information that they can look at when they're ready without having to ask you. Maybe it's designating another family member or a friend of yours that they can go to, maybe feel more comfortable talking to. So saying, okay, you can go and talk to Aunt Sarah when you're ready, that type of thing. Because sometimes it's easier coming from someone who's not our parent or our main caregiver. So having that conversation with them and just not taking it personally if they don't want to have that conversation with you. Because again, it can feel very awkward and uncomfortable, both as a parent and as a child who is kind of navigating this new world that they're not really familiar with.
Okay, so obviously some of these conversations can be uncomfortable, both for parents and caregivers and for children. Definitely I would encourage you to listen to body language and take the opportunity to teach some fun grounding techniques to kids. So as the graphic on the side shows, the exercise going through 5 senses is very helpful. If your child's on the younger side, I would say just like one of each, go through those just on one hand. Breathing techniques, super helpful for children to regulate emotions. In my house, the visual of scooping up water as we're breathing in and then letting it go gently down on the exhale was very helpful. Yoga, lots of fun for parents and children. There's some great online resources for that as well. Coloring, I spy or color search around the room. So thinking, show me 5 things that are green, or look around and try and find 5 things for the ABCs that start with A. Sensory toys like fidget spinners. Another fun one for young kids is the dragon exercise. So stomp, stomp, huff. These are all really fun grounding techniques that kids can start learning at a young age. And yeah, great, as I mentioned, for adults as well. We can join in and have some fun.
Yeah, and this is really something that you can look up, tons of different grounding exercises, and not just when you're having conversations about sexual violence or anything like that, but whenever your child may be feeling overwhelmed or just kind of something to bring them back into the present moment, and giving them those strategies so that they can, not only when you're having those conversations, but when they're kind of outside of the home or outside of your care, they have those sort of techniques that they can use when they're feeling overwhelmed, which can be really helpful for them.
Agree. I also think it's important to practice them when you don't need them. That way, when you are in a situation where you're really needing some solid grounding techniques, they're right there for you to remember easily.
Yeah. So we're going to be sending out a resource sheet, like I said, but we just wanted to touch on a few resources that are available. First of all, there's so many books and online resources that you can access. Many of them will be in, or some of them will be in the resource sheet we send you. Of course, there's so many more that are out there that we couldn't possibly put them all in, but there's lots of things that you can read with your child or watch with your child. That could help them, or books that your older child, so preteen and teens, can read on their own to kind of help them learn about boundaries and sexual health and things like that. Kids Help Phone is a huge resource that I hope everyone has already, but just in case you don't, it's 24 hours. Your child can call or text them. I believe it's up to the age of 26. That people can call and text, and giving them that number is really important, especially when they don't need it, so that they have it when they do need it. Something that they can keep with them. If they have access to a phone without you, then they can call without having to ask you for the number, because that sort of step to ask can be really difficult sometimes for kids. If they're in need of more formal counseling or support, there's Canark Child and Youth Services in Oshawa and Frontenac Youth Services, both of which provide programming for children and youth. And to contact them, you would call a central intake number, which is there. Again, will be on the resource sheet we send out, so don't worry about copying it down. Boost Child and Youth Advocacy Center in Toronto is a great one, especially for children who have experienced sort of online sexual violence, and they have a variety of programs as well. And like I said, Victim Services of Durham Region is a huge resource, especially for human trafficking, but really any form of victimization. So if your child does disclose that they've had an experience of sexual violence and you want information about going to police, for example, or potentially want support in finding counseling, they would be a great resource. Of course, us at the Durham Rape Crisis Center are always here as well. We can support counseling for people 16 and over. And then, like I said, if you're a support person for someone who's experienced sexual violence, up to 3 sessions. So that's something else to keep in mind. We unfortunately don't have the capacity right now to serve children under 16, but definitely if you want to reach out, we can direct you to where you can access like the resources we just mentioned. Just a little bit more about us as we sort of go into the Q&A section of our webinar. We do that individual counseling, like I mentioned. We do group workshops. We do public education like this webinar here, and advocacy where we can as well. So if you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to the contact information here. For anyone who is looking for those counseling sessions, you can email Michaela. Her email is on the screen here. And our crisis line is there as well. We are 24/7 available for people who want any sort of crisis or support, whether that's about having conversations with your kids or your own experiences. Yeah, so I think we will move now into any questions that anyone might have. We know that this is a lot of information. It's not meant to scare anyone or kind of push you into changing everything about how you parent your kids. It's just something to keep in mind to keep your children safe, and just little things that you can do to help them be able to know what consent is and to give it enthusiastically and freely, and kind of know when their boundaries have been violated. So I'm just going to stop the share right now so I can see everyone. If anyone has questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. You're welcome to unmute and ask us.
So there's no questions in the chat so far. We have a couple folks who've sent some positive feedback, thank you, great job, really informative. And so I just wanted to say, yes, thank you both so much. This was very informative. I learned a lot myself. I don't have children yet, but I actually do have a question. So when you had provided the example of, like, let's say your child doesn't feel like giving grandma a hug, really just letting them know that's okay, that they want their space, so on and so forth. And so I do agree with this. However, it's a bit controversial. I know different cultures go about this in different ways, and I see Michaela nodding as we're both Italian. And so I wonder, like, how do you, yes, and Akisha agrees. So like, as an Italian person, even if we're just, going to someone's house and greeting them, we give the 2 kisses on the cheeks and the hug. How would you navigate something like that?
So I'll just speak from personal experience, because I definitely know that that's been something that's been debated in my household. My personal views are that, children should not have to touch or hug if they don't want to. I do believe in teaching children manners, though. So my kids do still at least have to say goodbye and come to the door. They don't have to hug anyone if they don't want to. So at least being polite and doing that somehow.
Some sort of acknowledgement.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I have also perhaps been to other family members' homes where their children don't have to say goodbye at all. And I get it, but I just think it's nice to encourage good manners in our kids, but giving them that bodily autonomy of making their own decision and having different options, right? So maybe you just want to high five, maybe you just want to wave, like whatever it is that your child's comfortable with. I think follow their lead with that and lead by example of giving the choice.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, like giving choices is really a great way to like practice consent with your kids while still getting them to do the things that we need our kids to do, right? So you're not going to say, do you want to brush your teeth today? But you might say, do you want to brush your teeth now, or do you want to brush your teeth in 5 minutes? Or do you want to use this toothpaste or this toothpaste? Whatever it is, you can give them choices. And it's options. Still a way for them to have consent. So do you want to kiss grandma goodbye, or would you rather wave? Things like that, giving an option that's not touching them. And then I think also having conversations with those family members outside of the moment, because it's really awkward in the moment to say, oh, we have this thing about consent and this is what we do, but having that conversation maybe before they come over or another time where this is what we're teaching our child, this is why, because the why is really important. I hope none of our family members are offended that we want to teach our children to be safe. And that's a bigger problem if they don't, but just having those conversations outside of that awkward moment too, I think would be really important.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you both for your answers. There was even some in the chat, which are awesome. Super helpful. As I said, like, I know different cultures kind of have different rules, especially around like respect and stuff. And it's actually a conversation I've had with some family members too. And not like specifically like what I would do. It was just a general conversation. And they were saying like how rude it was that so-and-so's child did not greet them or like did not kiss them. And so I wonder, like different greetings, whether it is a wave or a hug, maybe not a kiss on the cheek or whatever the case may be. I think the reality is some people are probably going to find it like disrespectful. Honestly, I won't lie, like even with like your amazing answers. But at the end of the day, I'm sure it's, whatever you are comfortable with as a parent or a caregiver.
And I think it's also important for other family members or people that are visiting as adults to recognize that moods change. So just because my child wanted to give her uncle a hug last time he was at the door, she might not be in the mood for it today. And that's okay. We all as people carry our own emotions and feel like expressing them in different ways on different days. And especially as a child, like, important for us to be adults, right? It's not a sting or a personal attack. It should be celebrated.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you. Was there anyone else in our group today that wanted to share something or ask something? We have a couple things in the chat here. Akeisha first said, no questions. Thank you for the information. Happy to hear that so much of what you shared is already practiced in my home with my children. Awesome, Akeisha. And she also added, recently, the private conversation with family made a huge difference with my family understanding how my partner and I encourage consent with our kiddos. Awesome. That is really great. It's nice to hear, you know, someone who doesn't have children and who hopes to have children one day. It's nice to hear this stuff from other parents as well, just to see that we're still able to teach our children what is appropriate and what is right.
Well, it takes a village, right?
Think. Yeah, exactly. Just really to keep them safe. Absolutely.
I also just want to add that having these conversations with other family members is so important. Like if you're attending this webinar, chances are you're kind of already thinking about consent. You're already thinking about how to set those things with children. But the ones who might feel maybe personally offended or kind of uneasy about it, they're the ones that we might need to have those conversations with a bit more. So having that education piece, this is how we change the culture of consent and violence in our society, is having conversations with people who might not be seeking them out.
Hi folks. Awesome presentation. It was really, thank you so much for doing this and for sharing this. I am a very proud new aunt, and my nephew is only 8 months old, but we've been having visitors from my brother's friends who have slightly older children, and it's very interesting to see how, you know, my generation of folks are parenting their kids and talking about bodily autonomy. You know, we're already asking, like, you know, can I give you a hug, you know, to 2-year-olds and things like that, because we want them to understand that, well, maybe they don't want a hug, maybe they don't know you enough, maybe they don't feel safe enough. And those are good things. Like my brother's friend brought his like 2.5-year-old over, and I was like, oh, she wanted to say goodbye to me, and I said, oh, do you want to give me a hug? And she said no. I was like, do you want to give me a high five? And she said yes. And like just honoring those like little moments for her where she could like identify this. And even though my nephew's so little, you know, he was watching everything. Like he's very interested in bigger kids. And so you don't know what kind of seeds you're planting when you just do those little things. But as someone who like works in this field, it's really kind of hopeful. Like it's inspiring to think that like if we can give these tools at this very early age, that like when someone does something that they don't like, big, little, anywhere in between, that they'll be able to use their voice and like step back and take care of themselves. So yeah, I just thought, you know, when you put it into action, it's really exciting. So
Akeisha, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, Emma, you made me think about, as you mentioned, the bigger kids, that sometimes we focus so much on the adults, but I think like with my kiddos, I also tell them like, you don't have to hug other kids either. And I think there's always this, like when you're on the playground and a kid wants to play with you, parents are like, oh, it's just another kid, like go play with them. Like you can play tag or you can do this. And some of the boundaries dissipate when it's another kid. And so I just wanted to bring that up as another point. Maybe you have some more information on that, but like setting the boundaries with other kids is just as important as adults.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Diana?
First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It was so informative and you guys did an amazing job. It definitely got me thinking about just some things that had happened in my high school life to a very, very close friend of mine at the time. And so many years later, I realized, you know, that was grooming and doorstep to human trafficking. You know, a friend of mine, she had a part-time job after school, and you know, all of a sudden she's getting all of these expensive things, and her employer is sometimes paying her in cash and offering to drive her to school and to different places. And you know, she had told myself and our friend group what had been going on, but it had been happening for months. And it just kind of goes to show, like, when you don't talk to your kids about consent and about these very important, like having these important discussions with them, none of us knew what to do. We wanted to, call police. We wanted to tell her parents. We wanted to tell our parents, but we were afraid of what would happen because, her parents weren't necessarily the most open to those kinds of conversations. So, ultimately she got out of that job and out of that situation, but whatever was happening was going on for months, and nothing was really resolved during that time. So it just kind of goes to show how important, these conversations really are.
Yeah, and human trafficking consent is it's such a bigger conversation than what we can even begin to cover here, because it does start out as consenting in a lot of cases where they're building a relationship with someone that makes them feel good and they want to be in it until they don't. And it's toxic and manipulative and exploitative. So again, like there's lots of resources that are much more comprehensive than the conversation we can have here, but having I think that situational awareness that Michaela said is so important in addition to the consent, knowing, okay, why are these behaviors happening? Not being paranoid necessarily, because we want children to feel that they can be treated well in a relationship and things like that, but just kind of understanding the situation and understanding what a healthy relationship looks like is really important.
Absolutely. I was going to say, I think the term grooming is generally used for people who are, let's say, in the field or who are very much, who read up on these types of topics. But grooming is a term that's used specifically more towards the human trafficking, sex trafficking type of, form of abuse or sexual violence. But that being said, grooming can also happen in abusive relationships as well. And so if we're able to pay attention to those sorts of red flags, I'll call them, we can, hopefully protect our children better, or even our friends, our peers, really anyone, because it can happen at any age.
Yeah, sorry, just before Emma jumps in, I also want to add, like, grooming can also happen for the adults in that child's life. So them sort of preparing adults to trust them. So kind of emphasizing that they're a good person, you can trust them with your kids, things like that. That grooming is not just for a child to trust them, it's kind of making the people around them feel comfortable with them. And that kind of lets them have that freedom to do those exploitive or abusive things. Emma?
Yeah, it made me think of this concept that we have, and apologies, there's construction on my street, but this concept that we have of being nice, and how we in our culture are so emphasizing, you've got to be nice to your neighbor, you've got to be nice, and then we get into this habit of not trusting our own instincts. So being nice is more important than trusting our gut and prioritizing how and when we feel safe. And I think, in a lot of circumstances, we dismiss those feelings, those gut instincts, those oh, this doesn't seem right. And like Diana, I was thinking about your friend and how grooming happens gradually, right? It's like layers of abuse, right? You don't start off with a black eye, you start off with restricting, you start off with minimizing their feelings and on all of these things. And so if we prioritize this concept of oh, well, we've got to be nice to everybody despite how they make us feel, then we're getting into dangerous territory. There's been some really great movies or interesting movies, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and I don't know if anybody's seen it, and I'm ruining anything, but there's a scene where basically a man discovers that there's a serial killer, discovers who it is, and still talks to them, still interacts with them. And the serial killer later says, look how strong your conditioning was. You still felt the need to kind of be nice to me because, you didn't want to let on that you knew what I was. And just that kind of behavior, you can see how easy it is to step into that. Yeah, Tanya, yes, exactly. And I think about that sometimes, when is our conditioning for decorum and niceness really doing us the inverted service, right? Like it's the complete opposite of what is good for us. And like definitely not something I think we should replicate for the young ones. So, but yeah.
I think too, if I can jump in, I think that years ago, like several generations ago, there was this concept of like children should always obey and listen to their elders, and that in itself was a form of respect. And I think that landscape is shifting now to one of, as a parent myself, I want my children, I don't want them to be paranoid, but I want them to question why is this? And have a voice to say that. I think that those things should really be encouraged. I think that, yeah, respect can sometimes be confused with submission, which isn't okay.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any comments or questions before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. We really appreciate your time and your energy. For the people who might be watching the recording, thank you for tuning in. We hope that this was helpful. Again, you can always reach out to us if you have any questions, comments. You can always reach out to our crisis line. And like I said, our contact information is on the website as well, if you would like to go there. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.